Classes, so I'll have to keep it pretty far away from me. Let's go to question 43. Question 43. All right. For YouTube viewers at home, this is the AP practice test, right, that we are looking on, the one that's published by the College Board. Oh, the reason I picked this question is that obviously, yes, you do not have it? Yeah, hang on one second. Here you go, Bridget. Did I actually give it to you before? No? Oh, you went there? Okay. The reason I picked this one is this has to do with Bacon's Rebellion. For one reason or another, the AP loves these like little rebellions. I shouldn't call them little, they're significant rebellions, but you know, there's numerous rebellions that have happened in American history that kind of relate to the underclass sort of venting frustration against the established authority in various places. And Bacon's Rebellion, we reviewed in class, and we talked about in class, we reviewed in the review session. So here's a question that is relative to that information. Which of the following happened as a result of Bacon's Rebellion in 1676? Governor William Berkeley abolished the Virginia House of Burgess. Virginia passed new laws protecting workers' rights. Tensions between the backcountry farmers and the Tidewater gentry were exposed. Indentured servants received additional free land after fulfilling the terms of their service. And the king allowed Virginia colonists to select their own governor. Now, if you look at those answers, and without looking at the correct answer, would anyone just like immediately venture what they would say the correct answer was? Yes? C. C seems to be the correct answer. And that's the idea of Bacon's Rebellion, that it did expose that there were tensions between the backcountry farmers and the established plantation owners who were represented by Berkeley, and who was the governor. And Bacon was also a plantation owner who kind of tried to use this a little bit to kind of assert his own power. And remember, when we talked about it, we put it in the context of, in the aftermath also, the plantation owners tended to kind of stray away from indentured servants because these backcountry farmers tended to be former indentured servants that were no longer able to acquire land, which was their aspiration. Let's now go quickly to 5. 5 takes us back to, the Revolutionary War, and the British colonists in North America objected to the Stamp Act primarily because it threatened free press, it disrupted trade with the West Indies, it closed colonial courts, it enriched corrupt public officials, taxed them without their consent. Wow, look at that. Go ahead, Crawford, because you're conscious. I want to take advantage of that. Yes. E is the correct answer. Taxation without representation. Now, we reinforce that significantly in our in-class and in our review sessions, that the argument that was put forth against the Sugar Act in 64, the Stamp Act in 65, the Townsend Duties in 67, and then renewed against the Tea Act. Now remember, the Tea Act was not really it was something new, but the tax that they were protesting in the Tea Act was a tax that had been enacted as a result of the Townsend Duties. And then all of the Townsend Duties were repealed except for the tax on tea. Now, the Tea Act is going to force them to pay that tax that they consider to be taxation without representation. So really, this notion of taxing them without representation is what many of the colonists used as a justification for opposing these taxes. Now let's quickly go to 21. Now, I just looked at the topic of this, Tori. I didn't actually look at the actual question, so I hope that I get it right. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, attacked which of the following? France for its failure to support the colonial war effort, Parliament for its continued opposition to the King of England, politicians who believed a small island could not effectively rule a distant continent, the King of England and the principle of monarchy, or E, the authors of the Declaration of Independence? Now that's a little bit tougher. Anybody, I mean, you read, did you read Common Sense in English? No? Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Is it D?
I would agree that it is, in fact, D. Yes. Common sense attacks the king, right? It attacks the principle of monarchy. It attacks the king. I mean, it does make some mention of an island ruling a continent. But I mean, at the core, it's attacking this notion of monarchy, you know, and people's deference to the monarch. And we saw that even with the olive branch petition, that conservatives in colonial America were still clinging to kind of this notion of a monarch. And it's no accident that when Jefferson formulates the Declaration of Independence, that all of the kind of accusations against Britain are specific personal accusations against the king. So he said, let the facts be, you know, be presented, or I don't know what the exact words, to a candid world, right? And he says, look, you know, he presents in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence this notion that if the natural rights of people are violated, then it's the duty of the people to replace that government with one that does protect the natural rights. And then he says, let the facts be presented to a candid world. And he goes on to, you know, say, look, he, all these accusations against the king. And so, because this is the last link that connected colonial America with England. They had already been fully disenchanted with Parliament, and then they were even clinging to the king with the olive branch petition. So now, both Paine and Jefferson attack that last link to justify independence. Okay, we justify, go ahead, Alan.
Do you know what the answer to 38 is?
Does anybody have the answers on the back of their papers? Nobody. You do? What is 38? Tell Alan real quick. E?
E.
E. I'll get you the answers to all those questions. I do apologize. Now, so after going through all the preliminary actions that lead to independence, in the very end of our review session last time, we started to fight the war. Now, the Revolutionary War is just that, a war for independence. Americans are fighting to be independent. Really, the Revolutionary War is started, if you will, by Britain. Britain sends troops to New York in they sent troops to Boston initially, right? And those troops were to attempt to crush what they considered to be the rebels in Boston who were causing all kinds of problems. Well, in response to that attempt in Boston and New England, that prompts the Declaration of Independence. If you remember, that's the first phase of the war. Concord and Lexington, Bunker Hill, fighting in New England is the first phase of the war. That phase of the war ends before the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration of Independence, I think the British withdrew from Massachusetts, from Boston, somewhere in March of April of 1776, and then they're going to return to New York. Remember, we said there were 10,000 soldiers, and maybe 20,000 soldiers, and hundreds of ships that had the largest amphibious force that had ever landed in America was disembarked in New York about the same time the Declaration of Independence was signed. I mean, consider that in the light of what we talked about today, the amphibious invasion of France by America, Canada, and England. You know, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops that are going to land in France, and 5,000 vessels and 15,000 sorties of flights that are going to go over, and paratroopers, and a huge amphibious invasion. The invasion of New York by the British in July of 1776 was similar. They had 500 ships and thousands of, soldiers that disembarked there and invaded New York, took the city, pushed George Washington out, right, of the city. He fled to New Jersey, right, and we talked about, crossing the Delaware and how the war effort was sustained, in this phase of the fighting. But the most important battle in this second phase of fighting, the first is New England, the second in the Middle Colonies, was the Battle of Saratoga. And we talked about why. We mentioned that at the conclusion of our review session. And Ricky, what did we say was so important about the Battle of Saratoga in the Revolutionary War, making it probably the only battle that we might need to remember? Yes, it brings France into a formal alliance. It proves to the French that the United States is a viable military force and a viable country. So France agrees to recognize and align themselves with the United States. Now, if you think about it, we can go forward now and say that that alliance that was signed between France and the United States in the aftermath of the Battle of Saratoga was an entangling alliance, right? I mean, it was an entangling alliance with the French that later would be kind of, triggered to force us to assist France if they went to war with England in the Caribbean. Remember, I mean, so when Washington, when he retires, warns Americans about the danger of being involved in entangling alliances, the example that he's going to is this entangling alliance. That we form an alliance with the French say, okay, yes, we'll recognize you, but in the aftermath of that, we're going to require of you certain things, right? And that's the kind of entangling alliance that Washington said was problematic. Don't get involved in European affairs. And throughout most of American history, after this French alliance, we don't. If you think about it, the first time that Americans kind of violate that tradition of not becoming embroiled and entangled in European alliances is World War I. With World War I, we dive into the war, we are supporting that we're getting involved in Britain's problems, and in the aftermath of the war, Wilson is imploring Americans to join the League of Nations, to support the Treaty of Versailles, right, to basically become entangled in European affairs. And the Americans kind of reject that. Oh, this is not what we want to do. We're disenchanted with the way that Europe handled the peace after World War I. And so if you remember, that kind of sets the stage for what happened in World War II. In World War II, it's almost like we made the mistake. We violated our tradition. We got entangled in European business, and we shouldn't have done it. We're not going to do it again. And that's reflected in those neutrality acts that we talked about, that were passed. And American public opinion saying, we don't want to get involved in Europe's business. The isolationists that Roosevelt is fighting from the time that Hitler takes power in Germany up until Pearl Harbor is being bombed, Roosevelt is fighting those isolationists to kind of get America increasingly involved because he sees it as a danger to the safety and security of the United States. Well, okay, after the Battle of Saratoga, the third phase of the war is that southern phase of the war, where the British decide to attack South Carolina. They fight their way through Georgia and South Carolina up into North Carolina. And remember, a large British army is defeated in 1781 by Washington and his forces. General Cornwallis surrenders his entire army at the Battle of Yorktown. And when he does, the British agree to begin the negotiation of the peace. Right? The Battle of Yorktown is decisive. It's decisive in convincing the British to give up. Remember, we said that really what the United States had to do was get Britain to give up. I mean, Britain was fighting to keep us. And what the United States had to do was get them to abandon that, which they do. And in the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the big thing that Britain does, and France does, and Spain does, is recognize the United States as an independent, sovereign country. In addition to that, the Treaty of Paris, which ends the Revolutionary War, not only recognizes the United States as a sovereign country, it also kind of establishes the borders of that country. And remember, the most significant border concession is that the United States is ceded the entire area west of the Appalachians all the way to the Mississippi. south all the way to Florida, and north all the way to the Canadian border. Now, those borders to the United States are not firm fully. You know, where Florida is and where Canada is still on some level, you know, disputed. You know, those borders will be fully solidified in the future. But this kind of launches America. Here is this country that is birthed on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And now we said they have to give life and spirit to that idea in their government and in their society. Now, in terms of the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, I was looking at one of the review books today, and they talk about a lot of things. And we did too. We talked about, okay, what impact did the American Revolution have on America, right? I mean, and that almost seems dumb. You know, I mean, what do you mean, what impact did the American Revolution have on America? Well, one of the things that John Adams suggests is that the revolution was in the hearts and the minds of the people. And one of the things that means is, what was revolutionary was Americans kind of embracing republicanism. The idea of self-government. The idea of government by the consent of the governed. Now, I mean, what they were fully rejecting was deference. That because, you know, someone has a status or position or title, they have to be deferred to, right? So the structure of European society with positions and titles and you know, hierarchical society is challenged on some level by the idea that all men are created equal and the power of government emanates from the consent of the governed. Now, we said one of the things that this revolutionary notion challenges is the institution of slavery. So when we talk about all of the effects of the revolution on America, then one of them is the effect that the revolution had on slavery. Now, okay, what we argued in class is that the revolution and revolutionary ideas and ideas of equality and ideas of republicanism were recognized as being incongruent with slavery. I mean, the majority of Americans, including people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, people who owned slaves themselves, recognized that slavery was incongruent with the principles of the revolution. And to some extent, the revolution was an anti-slavery movement. When the revolution started, all 13 states, then soon to be colonies, had slavery. In the aftermath of the revolution, the 8 northern states, Pennsylvania and North, gradually will abolish slavery without coercion. So, in responding to the principles of the revolution, slavery is abolished in most northern states, gradually. It is made easier in the aftermath of the revolution to manumit. Manumit means to free your slaves, right, on your own. That becomes easier. And people are going to increasingly manumit their slaves, even in southern states. There is discussion in southern states, particularly Virginia, right up until 1831. They are discussing abolishing slavery in those southern states. However, despite the fact that slavery is assaulted by the revolution, and that it is abolished in places where it really is limited in scope, and that people use it as an inspiration to liberate their slaves, slavery survives the revolution. It is intact in the 5 southern states. And it actually spreads into new states of Kentucky, Tennessee eventually, and states that are in south of the Ohio River and south of the Mason-Dixon line, which is the line between Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. Well, okay, another thing that I was looking in another book that talked about, how about the impact of the revolution on women? Was there a dramatic change in the status of gender relations as a result of the revolution? And what most people suggest is that there was a modest change in the status of women. I mean, women don't fully step out of their gender roles. But one of the things that is pointed out is this notion of Republican motherhood. And I mention this because the AP loves this kind of stuff, right? They love this, you know, things like this notion of Republican motherhood. And that comes out of the American Revolution, suggesting that if we are going to be a republic, then the people have to understand what that means. What does self-government mean? What does republicanism mean? And certainly that's an encouragement for public education, but on some level, the idea was wives and mothers are responsible to inculcate, it means to teach, to inculcate the notions of Republican institutions into their children. So were women important to promoting Republican government? Yes, in the sense of Republican motherhood. Now, consider this, that the idea of Republican government is consent of the governed. And the most important aspect of self-government is in republicanism is voting for the representatives who will represent you. Look, you know, the idea of voting for representatives in representative bodies like the House of Burgess, the Massachusetts General Court, the Pennsylvania General Assembly, or any of these state assemblies, or eventually the Continental Congress or the Congress of the United States, right? You know, I mean, people would vote for those representatives. Women do not get the full constitutional vote until 1920. I mean, if you think about it, from the Revolution all the way up until 1920, it was up to the states to enfranchise women, and some states did. I mean, if you think about it, obviously Montana enfranchised women because Jeanette Rankin, who voted against World War I prior to 1920, obviously had the right to vote because she was in the U.S. Congress. So individual states could decide to enfranchise women, and some states did, but some states didn't. What the 19th Amendment did is prohibit states from denying the vote on the basis of gender, right? You couldn't deny the vote on the basis of gender. So that basically enfranchised all women of a certain age. But that's not until 1920. Well, okay. The most important thing to come out of the aftermath of the Revolution is certainly building governments. Governments that would be consistent with the ideology of the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution itself. The process of building governments started even before the Declaration of Independence was written and signed and ratified. I mean, the Continental Congress encouraged each of the 13 states to basically reconstitute themselves under, whatever basis they wanted to, prior to the Declaration of Independence. So we argued that all 13 states are going to develop a system of governance. In those 13 states, the principles that are going to be applied eventually to the federal government are there. All 13 of those states establish an executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch. 3 branches of government with separate powers that check and balance each other. Most of the states, with the exception of Pennsylvania for a short period of time, have a bicameral legislature. What does that mean, incidentally? If we have a bicameral, the Alexanders, yes? 2 houses of Congress. And Garness, while your hand is still up, if I have 2 houses of Congress, what is the implicit assumption if I have 2 houses of Congress? There is an assumption there.
One represents the population.
Yes.
The other represents membership, I guess?
Not membership, that there are 2 types of people. The common people and the elite, right? I mean, that's a recognition. Now, even today we have a House and the Senate, and that probably isn't a precedent today. But when those bicameral legislatures were erected in this period, it was a recognition that one house would represent the biggest and most influential property owners, and one house would represent the common property owners. Right? So I mean, it was a recognition that there were two types of people that had two types of interests that needed to be checked against each other. Each of the state governments that were formed had a Bill of Rights, certain rights that were guaranteed to the people within those states. Now, each of those states was considered on some level to be sovereign. A sovereign state that joined together, in a continental congress to seek independence from Britain. So, the question of forming new state governments is important, but another question would be, what would the government among those states look like? What would the central government look like? And remember, we said as early as 1777, the Continental Congress had commissioned, that was early as 1776, the Continental Congress had commissioned a committee to develop a system of central government. That committee was in fact headed by John Dickinson. And what that committee came up with, or eventually what Congress came up with, is what we call the Articles of Confederation, which was ratified by Congress in 1777 and was the first system of central government. Now, the individual states did not formally ratify the Articles of Confederation for 4 years. Does anybody remember, besides the instructor, why? The Articles of Confederation were formulated and ratified by the Continental Congress as the system of central government. Garness, who reads extensively at his house, has a thought. Yes?
Is it because of Western land?
Yes, it is exactly because of disputes over Western land. What did that mean? Megan, when I say, the reason that some states refused to sign and endorse the Articles of Confederation is a dispute over Western lands, what did that mean?
They felt they weren't getting their share of the Western lands.
Yes, so some states had claims to Western lands, other states did not, and eventually what was the agreement? Does anybody remember what the agreement was? Go ahead, Garness. Yes, that all those states would cede their claims to the federal government, and that land would be divided into equal, when I say equal states, not equal in size, but states that would be equal to the other states in influence and power in the new system of government. In other words, it's a pretty important thing, because it basically said that Virginia would not be able to establish a colony next to it. And North Carolina would not be able to establish a colony of North Carolina. And that America wouldn't establish colonies. What America would do is divide that territory into areas that would be put on the path to statehood. Now, does anybody remember, and it is under the Articles of Confederation, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but does anybody remember the congressional legislation that is passed, right, that kind of orchestrates organizing that land? Do you remember, Megan? Yes, those are the Northwest Ordinances, or we should call them, I think they're called the Northwest Land Ordinances, right? What did I call them, Janet, in class? Do you have it? Northwest Ordinance. So there's a land ordinance in 85 and one in 87. And they are generally written by Thomas Jefferson. And they set up a system by which these territories would be divided. And a system by which, they would be organized, and when so many settlers went there, then they could have a territorial legislature, and a territorial governor would be appointed by, the central government, and then once so many people went there, they could apply to admission to the Union as a state. If they applied to admission to the Union as a state, once they had met this criteria, then they would enter on equal status. And that was important. Now, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, right, we said was significant. It was part of this. But the Northwest Ordinance dealt with the territory north of the Ohio River. And it outlined how this territory would be organized and admitted to the Union as a state. But one of the significant things that the Northwest Ordinance did is it prohibited slavery in that Northwest Territory. There were no slaves there originally. And given that there were no slaves there, Congress, albeit under the Articles of Confederation, passed legislation that would prohibit slaves from going there. And so no slaves went there. And Jefferson called that the Empire of Liberty. And so, you know, this Northwest Ordinance, we said, is significant. It's significant, you know, for a number of reasons. One is it kind of reflects the idea that Americans understood, at least at that time, that slavery was inconsistent to what they aspired America to be. Because even Southerners voted for the Northwest Ordinance. Right? It's significant in that. It's also significant in that it established a precedent of Congress limiting or regulating slavery in the territories. And remember, that becomes the consequential issue in the United States in the aftermath of the Mexican War. In the aftermath of the Mexican War, the question becomes, can Congress pass legislation prohibiting slavery from spreading into the territories? And the people that said yes pointed back to the Northwest Ordinance, and they pointed back to the Missouri Compromise, and they said, not only can they have, right? You know, then ultimately what Southerners argued, if you remember, was maybe they had, but when they did, it was unconstitutional. Oh, this is off the subject of where we were at, but who is the final arbiter? When I always say, who is the final arbiter of constitutionality? Yes. The Supreme Court. So whether or not Congress could do that ultimately could be judged, if the argument was constitutionality, by the Supreme Court. Did the Supreme Court ever weigh in to that question? And if they did so, when? Eden, did the Supreme Court ever weigh in on that question and decide whether or not Congress could do that?
Yeah.
Yes, they did. When?
I don't remember.
Oh, blasted. Janet, do you recall? I'll call him Garness. His arm is tickling the ceiling there. Yes. The Dred Scott decision. And when they did with the Dred Scott decision, they said it was unconstitutional for Congress to limit slavery in the territories. Now, okay, under the Articles of Confederation, tell me one thing, well, I should say this. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central government was limited to a unicameral legislature, one House of Congress. Congress included delegates from all 13 states. However, the delegations from those states voted by state. So in Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government was limited to one House of Congress. The Congress voted by state, so there were 13 votes, regardless of the number of delegates that were sent. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive branch, there was no judicial branch, just Congress. Tell me one thing that Congress was authorized to do under the Articles of Confederation. One thing that Congress was authorized to do. Go ahead, Tori. What could Congress do under the Articles of Confederation?
Could they tax?
They could not. That was the big thing that they could not do. But Jake, what was one thing they could do?
Request money from states.
They could request money from states. Yes, what else?
Declare war.
They could declare war and they could make peace. Now, besides not being able to tax, Cassandra, tell me something else they couldn't do. Under the Articles of Confederation. The sometimes dozing Alan has a thought. Yes, go ahead, Alan. Alan, stop right there. Are you participating in a Frisbee football game today after school?
Yeah.
Where is it at?
Probably the library field.
Oh, I've got to come. I've got to come and watch you participate. I might sleep. Would that be okay? I mean, just to be fair, I might just put my head down on the thing. All right. So, Alan, what was the question I originally asked you?
Something about what the Articles of Confederation can do.
Yes, say it.
I was going to say maybe they couldn't regulate commerce.
Yes. They could not regulate commerce. They could not tax. They could not raise an army. So there were important limitations to the power of commerce. Right? Now, I mean, Congress was made specifically weak. I mean, it would not have been likely or reasonable that in the aftermath of the American Revolution, which was the rejection of strong central government, for the founders to create another strong central government. But there were problems under the Articles of Confederation. Probably the biggest problem under the Articles of Confederation was what? What was probably the biggest problem? Go ahead, Ernest.
Couldn't pay its debts.
Yes. It couldn't pay its debts to its bondholders. It couldn't pay its debts to its soldiers, the veterans of the war. Remember we talked about the Newburgh Conspiracy, you know, in Washington kind of settling down the officers of the Continental Army who wanted to march on Philadelphia to get their money. You know, so this was a big problem because, Jake, as you said, they could request funds, but the states did not have to provide them. And so there was some element of chaos. And that chaos was embodied by one particular incident, Shays Rebellion, 1786. What was Shays Rebellion? Does anyone besides the instructor remember? Does anyone, go ahead, Janet, what was Shays Rebellion?
Angry farmers went to the courthouse to get their full president.
Yes, it was angry farmers. What state? Go ahead. Massachusetts. Western Massachusetts, angry farmers, frustrated by what they saw as unfair taxes, frustrated by the federal government's inability to pay their pensions to war veterans, frustrated by not having a lot of paper money, you know, in order to pay their bills, a lack of hard currency, you know, frustrated because their farms were being foreclosed upon, basically took over the federal or the local government in that area and then seized a federal armory in Springfield, Massachusetts, and prompted what seemed to be a threat to the stability of Massachusetts and maybe the country. Shays Rebellion was put down, right? But it really was influential in frightening some people. I mean, and now we made this point, and I don't know if you'll remember this or not. You know, part of the thing about Shays Rebellion is it represents anarchy, right? And, you know, we said that what America is struggling in its formative years with is a balance between liberty and order. You know, okay, we want to promote the liberty that is part of the ideology of the Declaration of Independence, but that's got to be consistent with some level of order. And Shays Rebellion seems to be disorder. So, okay, if we kind of attempt to establish order, that's going to limit liberty. And the other thing that was kind of there was a fear by some people that state governments had become too powerful and too greatly influenced by the masses. That the masses would use the power of state government to interfere with private property, order, and stability. And so that there needed to be some kind of powerful, more powerful central government to ensure that there was enough order to protect liberty. The result is a movement to revise the Articles of Confederation that starts in Annapolis, Maryland in 1886 with people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, who argue that a more powerful central government is crucial to protecting the Republican experiment, to legitimizing the government under the Declaration of Independence. The Annapolis Convention, as it was called, really has a limited turnout, but Hamilton and Madison are influential enough to get, I think, the state of Virginia to call for another meeting, and then the Continental Congress, the Congress under the Articles, to endorse the call for that meeting in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. That subsequent meeting which we call the Constitutional Convention, convened in May of 1787 for the purpose, you recall, of modifying the Articles of Confederation. 12 of the 13 then states sent delegations to that convention. What state did not? Look at all the people, Sam, look at all the people that know. Yes, go ahead, Sam. Rhode Island did not send a delegation, right? The other 12 states did. Now, one of the interesting things that we did, I don't know if you remember this because I know you kids try to blot it all out of your minds, right? One of the interesting things that we did is we talked about who was not at the Constitutional Convention and who was. Faya, give me an example of a prominent person who we would expect to be at the Continental or at the Constitutional Convention, but was not there. Blasted. Bridget, your dear friend does not know. Do you have an idea? Son of a gun. Crawford even had his eye. He's been conscious the entire time. This is a red letter day. Crawford, do you have an idea? Was there. The oldest delegate, Megan, was not there. Where was he?
He was in Britain or France.
Ambassador to France. Cassandra. Yes, go ahead. Was not there. Was suspicious of the entire thing. Who else? Was George Washington there? Yes, he was. He was eventually made presiding officer. Right? Was John Adams there? No. He was the ambassador to England. Was Alexander Hamilton there? Yes. And the most important delegate maybe at the Constitutional Convention was Madison. Why? Yes.
He laid out the initial plan.
Yes, what was it called?
The Virginia plan.
The Virginia Plan. He establishes the initial plan, which is called the Virginia Plan, which eventually is rejected. Who rejects the Virginia Plan and why?
New Jersey?
Yeah, well, in New Jersey, right? The New Jersey Plan it represents the small states. The small states reject the Virginia Plan, propose the New Jersey Plan, and this is a significant dispute. How does it end? How does it end? Yes.
The Great Compromise.
Yes, the Great Compromise of the Constitution, which is called the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise is what we have today. A bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives that is elected directly by the people. A Senate that was elected originally in the Constitution, or senators appointed by state originally in the Constitution. How? Originally in the Constitution. Quickly. How? Yes.
Left by state legislatures.
State legislatures. And then eventually, what amendment provided for the direct election of senators? It's a bonus question. You'll get this. It's a bonus question. You'll get this on the back of the test. Yes.
Was it 24?
No. 17th. 17th Amendment. 17th Amendment. Now, okay. Unfortunately, I've got to go to the dentist. So, it's 20 after. And, no offense, Garness, it's DiPiazza. I've been going to the dentist all my life.
I'll see you with a nice dentist.
Yeah, that's right. DiPiazza is 80 years old. He's been my dentist since I was 14. Right? Now he's old, so it's his daughter. Right there's the main man, right there, kids. Everyone else is a pretender. Right there is the main man.